Hello, here we are again. We are bringing the Lenten studies to a close today, and it's going to be a little different because I'm used to interacting with everybody during these, but we had one more study. Last week we kind of plowed ahead and we pushed through and got through Nicodemus, and this week we are going to talk about Pontius Pilate and we are going to talk about Judas Iscariot. If you remember, we were talking about significant people who were at in the week of the Passion. So, before we get started, I just want to remind everybody that the deepest sympathies for the family of Maxine Fellows, who passed away early this morning. Such a sweet, dear person to all of us, and in such a terrible time. But more details as we come on that. I will be posting those out on Facebook and sending an email with all of that. Also, just pray for each other, reach out for each other, make sure everybody's doing okay. Pontius Pilate. He's an interesting character, and the study that we've been working on with this Dr. Kathy Randall and her cohort, Dr. Brent Landau, paint a very different picture of Pontius Pilate than what we have seen in the past. Often we think of Pontius Pilate as almost sympathetic towards Jesus, and they say that is not the situation at all. Actually, the very first thing I want to point out is Pontius Pilate is actually mentioned in the Apostles' Creed. And I don't know if you really noticed that, but it suffered under Pontius Pilate, was crucified, dead, and buried. And it actually, if you remember the sermon we did several years ago now, or the series we did on the Apostles' Creed, that actually gives credence to the Apostles' Creed, gives us a dated period to which to tie things to, and I'll get into that in just a little bit more, but it also helps kind of date the time of Jesus' death and resurrection as happening under Pontius Pilate. Pontius Pilate was a Roman prefect. He was a member of the military, and basically he was an officer in the military, but he was someone who was chosen by the emperor to govern a position. And he governed Judea from roughly 26 to 29 Common Era, which would have been somewhere around 30-ish AD. The prefect of the city was responsible for maintaining law and order for Rome and acquired full criminal jurisdiction in the region. So in other words, he had the total authority to do basically what he wanted in the region, except he really couldn't interfere with Jewish law too much, or if he was smart, he wouldn't. And I'll explain why that happened in just a minute. One of the things that prefects did is they did not want any attention from the emperor. It's kind of like when I was a school principal. It's better to ask forgiveness and permission sometimes. But the one thing you did not want was the superintendent having to call you and ask what was going on. You simply just didn't want to involve them if you didn't have to. It made you, I want to say look weak, but it just was something that you needed to handle on your own. Something significant happened in 1961, and that is in a town called Caesarea Maritima. They found an inscription that was dedicated primarily and solely to Pontius Pilate and his reign there. And to date, that is the only truly archaeological evidence for any individual directly associated with Jesus. We have a lot of written things, we have the Bible and so forth, but as far as directly linked archaeological evidence, there's not a lot out there. We have many sites that we consider holy, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, the Church of the Nativity, but those things have been passed down through generation and generation as this is where it happened. But there's really no inscriptions or anything that say this was the exact spot. They are veneered things. They are things that people have adorated, and I don't want to say that they're not true, but there's nothing archaeologically to say that. A lot of that has to do with the culture and the very much changing times in that period of the world, where things were in a lot of turmoil. different groups, conquered different groups. And in part of conquering, they would totally destroy what they had and build on top of and so forth. So we've just lost it over the centuries. We often think of Pontius Pilate, as I said, maybe being a little bit lenient with Jesus because of his washing of his hands, but they pointed out that the evidence that they found is that Pontius Pilate was truly a brutal person. He was blatantly disrespectful to the Jewish religion. Jerusalem, which was in Judea, was usually kind of left alone. Kind of govern themselves, don't cause me any problems, I won't cause you any problems. And overnight, one night, Pontius Pilate brought in images of the emperor and placed them all over the city. He had to remove them under threat of upheaval from the Jewish people, but he blatantly kind of provoked them on that. He built an aqueduct for Jerusalem, for the city of Jerusalem, to provide much needed water out of the mountains. But even though that sounds like he did something wonderful for them, he actually just stole the money from their treasury, or from the temple treasury, and used it to build the aqueduct. Sorry that the dog is barking. We tried putting him up and everything else, but we have a dog that if someone drives by, that's what happens. A Samaritan prophet plays a big part in this, and he had called a large crowd of people to Mount Gerizim to show them holy vessels that they believed were hidden and he had found from Moses. This was kind of a threat to Pontius Pilate. It was kind of building the case for the prophecies. And Pilate saw it as an insurrection. And so Pilate kind of messed up here. He sent the infantry and the cavalry, and just basically he killed the prophet, the Samaritan prophet, and he killed pretty much all of the people that were there. And like I said, you don't want a lot of attention from the emperor, but this one got Emperor Nero's attention, or Caesar's attention, and Pilate got called to Rome for this, actually. And so to be called to the emperor's hometown and before his presence was not a good thing. He tried to explain the reasoning behind what he was trying to do, but it did not go well. He was basically, as we would say in today's terms, he was spanked. And so that may give us a clue of why he dealt so softly with Jesus. And that may have been part of God's greater plan in the long run. In the biblical references, Mark 15:5, Pilate contemplates Jesus' silence. Mark 15:14, Pilate asks the crowd what evil Jesus has done. And once you kind of look back at the thing we just talked about, that he had made a mistake, he's trying to figure out a way to not have to deal with Jesus, basically. Matthew 27:19, we've moved from Mark to Matthew at this point, is where we hear about Pontius Pilate's wife warning him of the man in her dreams. Matthew 27:24, 25 is the famous washing of the hands so that there's no blood on him. And he wanted to make sure of that, which truly makes sense when you hear about the insurrection and how he handled it wrongly before. And then Luke 23:6-7, he transfers Jesus over to Herod Antipas, which is a Jewish counterpart, or the king of the Jews. And they were the ones that actually sentenced to Jesus. Now, we're going to move on to Judas Iscariot, making this a little bit shorter because, one, it's probably not as exciting when we're not talking together, but at least we're being able to do this. And if you remember on that scale of near to far, with Mary being very close to Jesus, Mary Magdalene, and then Peter, and then moving across that scale of Nicodemus, Pontius Pilate, Judas was probably the one that was at one point very near to Jesus, but ended up the farthest away. They point out something that I found was very interesting, because we hear the name Judas a lot in the Bible. And it was, at that time, a very, very common name. Judas was very common. Jude, variations of the name were very common, but no one names their child Judas anymore. It's just simple. It has gone down with Benedict Arnold and several others as traitorous names, and we just simply do not use the name anymore. There is some controversy over the Iscariot part. In Hebrew, it could have meant Ish Kirioth, or a man of Kirioth, meaning that was where he was from. In Greek, Sicarius was a Jewish freedom fighter and also an assassin, hired assassins. And the problem here is the historians are not sure whether those people actually existed yet at the time of Jesus. But some people make reference to the Iscariot maybe being part of the Greek assassin group. There's a lot of biblical references to Judas. We're going to start with Mark. He is listed in 3:19 as one of the 12 disciples, one of the 12 closest to Jesus. There were probably more than 12, but there are as things grew. But at the original time, there were 12. Mark 14:10 talks about his visit with the chief priest to arrange the betrayal. And all of you know there he got 30 pieces of silver. And we'll get into that in just a little bit. Mark 14:43-45 talks about the kiss of betrayal in the Garden of Gethsemane. And that, of course, they didn't have wanted pictures of Jesus and things we have now. Someone had to indicate which one was actually Jesus when they did get to the Garden of Gethsemane. And Judas, of course, accepted the bribe to do that. Mark 14:21, Jesus states it would have been better that the man never be born at all than to betray the Son of God. So that is a very strong and powerful statement from Jesus, that it would be better if the man had never been born at all than to betray the Son of God. Luke just doesn't have many details at all about Judas Iscariot. He doesn't focus on it. Matthew and John do. Matthew 16:15 says Judas played dumb at the Last Supper. And if you remember, we have been looking up these scriptures and talking together, but it's the part where Jesus says, someone here is going to betray me, and they all kind of looked at each other like, which one? And Judas acted like nothing was wrong. Matthew 27:3-5, Judas tries to return the money. He was feeling so guilty about what he'd done, he tried to return the money to the Jews that had given it to him, and they refused. Matthew 27:3-5, I just said that. Judas tried to return the money. John 12:4-6 points out that Judas was actually the group's treasurer. Of the 12 disciples, he was the treasurer. He was in charge of the money, and that is why maybe he was so upset that Mary poured out the pint of nard to wash Jesus' feet and dry them with her hair. John 13:26-30 states that Satan entered him and he goes out into the night. So when he went to betray Jesus, according to the book of John, Satan actually entered Judas and pushed him out to do this. Matthew 27:5-8 clearly tells us that Judas hangs himself and the money is used to buy a field called the Field of Blood, which was used to bury foreigners. And so if we really think of it in that sense, that was a true disrespectful gesture towards Judas. Jewish burial customs are very strict. Jewish cemeteries are very strict things. Foreigners or unclean people were never buried in Jewish cemeteries, so they actually used the money that Judas, those 30 pieces of silver, to buy a field where they would bury foreigners who was in Jerusalem at the time of their death. The next we hear is in Acts 1:17-18. He was one of our number and shared our ministry. With the payment he received for his wickedness, Judas bought a field where he fell headlong. His body burst open and all of his intestines spilled out. So there's conflicting stories on Judas's death. Matthew says he hanged himself, but in Acts it talks about him falling into a pit headlong and then having his body burst open and his intestines spill out. Either way, not real pretty. In 2006, the National Geographic Society financed the purchase and publication of a fragmentary manuscript, meaning just little pieces that were found containing the Gospel of Judas. And as you know, we've talked about the canonical, the apocryphal, the Gnostics. This is a Gnostic Gospel. And in this Gospel, it's kind of interesting. I remember getting that issue of National Geographic and reading it, and it was very interesting at the time. But Judas claims he was a hero, that Jesus actually asked him to betray him, that was part of God's plan, and someone had to help him put it into action, and Judas was the one that was chosen. Few scholars believe that there's any accuracy in this, but it does kind of make you think sometimes. Could someone love another so much that they would damn their own soul for their being? It is difficult to say. That is a very, very brief version, simply because we were not able to discuss things together. If you have questions or anything, just shoot me a text. I'll be happy to try to answer them. We were only going to have 4 Lenten studies this season anyway, because I was to be at the Walk to Emmaus on the last Sunday before Palm Sunday on March 29th, and that has too been canceled. So hopefully everyone's sheltering in place good, the food is good, you're having some good quality time, and I've given you something to think about right now. So have a great one. Thanks.